So, on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and the Labor Solidarity Project here at the University of Washington, Tacoma, I'd like to welcome everyone back to our fall seminar series, Educate, Agitate, and Organize. My name is Alex Miller, and I'm an associate teaching professor here at UW-T, where I teach labor studies, American studies, and literature. And I'm really excited about tonight's event. I know I say that every week, but this time I really mean it because we are boldly going where no labor seminar has gone before. So over the last few years, I think I've hosted close to 40 of these events. And looking down the list, I feel like we've spent most of our time sort of looking back, at least historically, right? We're kind of studying, the histories of workers and organizing efforts across space and time. Some of these events have kind of concluded with moments where we kind of look forward and imagine, a future of possibilities, right? Worlds where sort of capitalism proceeds unchecked, but also futures where, workers come together and demand more. And if you know me, I'm committed to this second vision, right? And I think that those conversations are actually really important, right? And that believing that there's a future worth fighting for is kind of an essential part of what solidarity is all about. And I think imagining that future is an exercise in hope, which in and of itself nowadays feels like a kind of radicalism, right? And I think it's this kind of imagining that's precisely what we're going to be discussing tonight. We're going to be exploring what Star Trek's Deep Space Nine has to say about our potential futures. So this is a very special episode that I think really expands what it means when we say that we're studying labor. And fortunately, we have an outstanding guest tonight to pilot us through this particular wormhole. And I promise you there will be more Star Trek puns to follow. But before those, let's get to the introductions. I want to welcome our guest tonight, Dr. David Seitz, who's zooming in from Los Angeles. He's an associate professor of cultural geography in the Department of Humanities, Social Science, and the Arts at Harvey Mudd College in Claremont, California. He's a critical geographer of liberal multiculturalism with interest in gentrification, immigration, queer community formation, pop culture, and socialist strategy. He's also the author of two books, A House of Prayer for All People, Contesting Citizenship in a Queer Church, and the book we're going to be discussing tonight that was actually published just earlier this summer. So brand new, hot off the press, A Different Trek, Radical Geographies of Deep Space Nine. So I'd like to thank you, David, for joining us this evening. I'm just really so excited to share this work with our campus and our community. And I just, this obviously very near and dear to my heart when you bring this expertise to this seminar. So we're going to stick to our usual scheduled programming in terms of presentation followed by some Q&A. We had some fantastic questions submitted ahead of time. But if you have questions, just feel free to type them into the chat room as they arise. So with that said, please join me in giving our guest tonight a warm UW-T LSP welcome.
Thank you all so much. It is truly an honor to be here under the auspices of UW-T and the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies. The Labor Solidarity Project brings together such insightful organizers and scholars, and I'm really grateful to Alex Miller, both for the work that goes into this project and for the generosity of including a book about popular culture. So I want to talk to you today. Let's see if I can get this slide advanced. I want to talk to you today about culture as a domain of meaning, belonging, and identification, about culture as a site of dynamism and contestation, about culture as something that everyone produces, consumes, and reproduces, sometimes with a critical difference. My students at Harvey Mudd College, which is a liberal arts institution, but is also importantly a science and engineering school, tend to think of culture as something discrete, as something that can be isolated and known objectively, like a lab culture. And I try to remind them to think of culture more like eating yogurt, not Yoplait, but maybe something more high-end and organic, as something that's live and active, full of microorganisms that are always acting on and being acted on by other microorganisms, and as something participatory, a scene in which observation is always implicated in the scene itself, where the microorganisms are struggling it out, and so are we. Both my field of study, human geography, and my object of study, popular culture, have historically done a lot of cultural work in the service of imperialisms of various kinds. Over the past 500 years, the late British geographer Clive Barnett observed that human geographers carved up the knowledge of the world's people and places into bits, turning that knowledge into raw material to be mined and extracted, often directly in the service of Western empires in search of other raw materials. Popular culture has often likewise played along, constructing distorted geographical knowledges of foreign peoples and places, and eliciting identifications with power from adventuresome and loyal metropolitan subjects. But as the more dynamic understanding of culture that I alluded to a minute ago suggests, both human geography and popular culture are messy. They're subject to contestation, renegotiation, and reimagination under shifting historical conditions. In the time that we have here today, I want to explore 3 questions about the cultural politics and geographies of Star Trek. The first concerns Star Trek's political and aesthetic inheritances, where it comes from. The second concerns how Deep Space Nine, the Star Trek series that is the principal object of my book, both extends but also interrupts Star Trek's inheritances. And the third concerns the geographies of Star Trek's consumption, the sometimes surprising things that people have used Star Trek in general, and Deep Space Nine in particular, to do. Now, I'm assuming that most people in this Zoom room have at least heard of Star Trek, which is among the most recognized and highest grossing multimedia franchises of all time. Gene Roddenberry's American original science fiction television program, was relatively short-lived, airing from 1966 to 1969. But its campy aesthetics, memorable characters, little morality plays, and above all, its vision of a cooperative human future devoid of racism, capitalist scarcity, and war have given it an exceptionally long afterlife in syndication. As I'll emphasize, all of these cultural products are deeply contradictory. The gender politics of the original series, for instance, are often really not great. But even here, we see contestation, renegotiation, and reimagination. We see it in Nichelle Nichols' memoir, Beyond Uhura, about her work on Star Trek, her interventions on and off screen. And we see it in the powerful interventions of women in the Trek audience, Betty Jo Trimble, Joan Winston, and others who proved instrumental to organizing the first pressure campaigns and fan conventions that eventually compelled studios to produce new iterations of Trek, beginning with Star Trek the Animated Series in 1973. People tend to be less familiar, though, with Deep Space Nine, Star Trek's 4th installment, which ran from 1993 to 1999 and is the focus of my book. DS9 starred Avery Brooks as Benjamin Lafayette Sisko, Star Trek's first Black captain. It elaborated an extended metaphor for the Palestinian liberation struggle, and it featured the first same-sex kiss in the franchise. The show is well regarded by hardcore fans and critics, but it has gotten strangely little attention in the Academy, outside of a number of excellent articles and book chapters in Black studies, including the works of Andre Carrington and Mark Anthony Neal, to which I am indebted and on which I seek to build. Showrunner Iris Stephen Bear has not quite jokingly referred to DS9 as the bastard or forgotten middle child of the Star Trek franchise. And if you Google scholar searches for various Star Trek programs, Deep Space Nine comes in dead last of the 1990s Star Treks. My book makes the argument that the show deserves greater scholarly attention and political as well as aesthetic vindication. And this brings me to my 3 Star Trek questions. So first, what are Star Trek's inheritances? Star Trek did not emerge sui generis from Gene Roddenberry's head or from the vacuum of space. Indeed, as the Leech Lake Band Ojibwe geographer DeAndre Smiles reminds us, quote, outer space is not the first final frontier. The very emergence of the speculative fiction genre was conditioned by the technologies, nationalisms, and economic transformations of 19th century empires, and contemporary mainstream US speculative fiction, film, and television are the byproduct of Southern California's striated geographies, the love child of the military-industrial academic complex and Hollywood. Roddenberry, who created the original series and continued to play an important role in the franchise until his passing in 1991, named English writer C.S. Forrester's imperial Horatio Hornblower novels and American settler colonial westerns like the television series Wagon Train as his principal sources of inspiration. Prior to Star Trek, Roddenberry served as a U.S. Army Air Corps pilot and then as a Los Angeles Police Department officer. He worked as a speechwriter for the notoriously racist LAPD chief William H. Parker, a cold, detached man with whom he often clashed. Roddenberry later remarked that it was Parker's infuriatingly hyper-rational demeanor that inspired Star Trek's Vulcan Mr. Spock. The original series premiered just a few years after US President John F. Kennedy's moon speech, which positioned the space race with the USSR as the new frontier in US expansionist ideology. The word trek itself derives from an Afrikaans word for a sojourn into a territory from a settler's point of view. In 1838, thousands of Dutch-speaking Boer colonists in South Africa embarked on the Voortrek, or Great Trek, packing their wagons and relocating outside the reach of British imperial rule. Chief among the Boers' complaints was the British Empire's abolition of slavery, an institution that the Boers wished to preserve. Given these inheritances, it is to Star Trek's great credit that it nevertheless imagined a peaceful future in which Russians, white American settlers, Africans, and Japanese people harmoniously collaborated, and where both women and men held positions of leadership. The secular federation had eradicated capitalism and racism, allowing all people to freely share in the abundance enabled by high technology. The original series Vietnam War allegories gradually shifted from a defense of militaristic theories of the balance of power to a rejection of imperialism, and Roddenberry, George Takei, Leonard Nimoy, and others involved with the show publicly came out against the war. At a time when the capacity of US liberal democracy to overcome white supremacy and capitalist inequality was under intensified scrutiny at home and abroad, Star Trek proffered an optimistic future that was both recognizably American and distant enough to offer modest, imminent critiques of the United States. Rather than a hopelessly complicit trapping of a reactionary culture or a purely radical redemptive text, then, Star Trek is perhaps best understood as a contradictory byproduct of the US Cold War liberalism of the 1960s. US political historian Lily Geismer helpfully defines liberalism in this context as, quote, not radical and especially not conservative. Given this nebulous definition, it's not surprising that US Cold War liberalism spanned an incoherent field of positions. Quick to disavow the right, but reluctant to embrace the left, Cold War liberals supported labor unions and civil rights within the United States, but often hesitated to condemn the anti-communist repression to which many Black and labor radicals were subjected. Cold War liberals opposed the socialism and communism that had helped ignite the radical imagination of racialized peoples struggling for decolonization, at times doing so even when it meant propping up right-wing dictatorships. In the wake of the Cold War, Star Trek identified new antagonists in new allegorical storylines. But its residual Cold War liberalism, articulating multicultural diversity with US moral superiority and military primacy, has often persisted. Though its critique is far from complete, DS9 has arguably gone further than any other Trek installment in questioning the Federation's official myths about itself, and thus in questioning the pretensions of US imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy. And this brings me to my second question. So the second question again is, how does Deep Space Nine both extend and interrupt Star Trek's inheritances? From the very outset of the program in 1993, what audiences encountered in Deep Space Nine defied their expectations. Since its premiere in the 1960s, Star Trek, drawing inspiration from those British imperial maritime novels and US settler colonial westerns, had been organized around the same geographical logic: outward-facing exploration. Highly episodic and shunning serialization, save for the occasional cliffhanger, Trek to date had been about one-off colonial encounters, alien of the week titillation, and tidy solutions dispensed at warp speed by the USS Enterprise, the flagship spacecraft of the United Federation of Planets. By contrast, DS9 was stuck in place. Anchored at a space station near a recently decolonized planet, Bajor, which was celebrating hard-fought independence after 50 years of genocidal, extractive occupation by the Cardassian Empire. The station's top Federation officer, Commander Benjamin Sisko, was a Black single father from New Orleans, a grieving widower who didn't want to accept his assignment, helping the Bajoran provisional government rebuild after Cardassian withdrawal. Its Bajoran first officer, Major Kira Nerys, played by Nana Visitor, was a former anti-colonial revolutionary, Cardassians would say terrorist, who now found herself reluctantly thrown into the role of post-colonial government official. Like many Bajorans, Kira is a devout follower of the prophets, extra-dimensional beings who guide her planet's liberation struggle and who have a vision for Bajor and for Sisko. The space station's crew was composed principally of Bajorans and other extraterrestrials. As film studies and Black studies scholar Michael C. Pounds put it, quote, "This dramatis personae clearly indicated that DS9 was not going to be a Star Trek television series that would dwell on the wonders of future technology or being bold galactic explorers. Indeed not. Even the physical structure that these characters inhabited, a celestial port city, was itself a post-colonial, post-industrial ruin, intended by set designer Michael Okuda to resemble an offshore oil rig. That's the structure you see on the bottom there on the image on the left-hand side. A relic of the Cardassian occupation, when it was known as the Terak Nor Ore Processing Facility and Labor Camp, the station was repurposed and renamed by Bajorans during decolonization. Defeated by the Bajoran resistance, embittered Cardassian colonizers trashed the station on their way out, murdering Bajoran merchants and stripping the station and the planet below of every component of value. Instead of the glittering optimism of the Enterprise bridge, what US audiences saw on the station's busted up promenade looked a lot more like their own tumultuous society. Many recognized in DS9's wreckage the streets of Los Angeles, which in spring 1992 had been swept by a multiracial rebellion against racism, capitalism, state violence, and what the geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment. The uprising was sparked by outrage at impunity for the beating of Black motorist Rodney Glenn King by white police, and for the murder of Black teenager Latasha Harlins by a Korean-American convenience store owner. Rodney King's plea to Angelenos to end the violence, "Can we all get along?" Is perhaps the most remembered part of the statement that he made at the time. But his remarks actually closed with an explicitly geographical and existential reflection. "We're all stuck here for a while," he told Angelenos. Let's try to work it out. Let's try to work it out." Star Trek is often hailed for its prophetic dimensions, both anticipating technological innovation, and I always put innovation in quotes because I teach tech students who are very confident in technological innovation, which I'm sure those of you in the greater Seattle area can appreciate as well. Just getting a little dig in at that kind of tech arrogance. Both anticipating technological innovation and using allegory and optimistic visions of a utopian future to comment critically on war, racism, and capitalist inequality here and now. But Trek has almost always articulated this futurity through starships, explorers, and other images of mobility, and leaving places behind, as the late artist and critic John Berger observed, as a way of concealing consequences. DS9's stationary allegorical geography meant that from the outset, it would be, as series writer Robert Hewitt Wolf put it, quote, a show about consequences. The series juxtaposes multiple clashing political, economic, and cultural perspectives embedded in a single contested place, one far from the glitz of the Enterprise or the manicured lawns of Starfleet headquarters. It foregrounds contradictions between the Federation's comfortable core and its misunderstood and exploited Bajoran periphery, from the outside looking in. Instead of an itinerant spacecraft, this was a place where consequences would have to be, as Rodney King suggested, worked out. So in the time that I've got left, and in the spirit of DS9's intensive place-based focus, I want to provide you with just one in-depth example. This is Quark's. Quark's bar, grill, gaming house, and holosuite arcade, universally known simply as Quark's. It's a Ferengi establishment on the station, meaning it's run by members of the most unabashedly capitalist society in the Star Trek universe. In the wake of the Cardassian occupation, Deep Space Nine becomes a destination for an eclectic group of Bajoran and off-world patrons, and for the people who entertain, heal, teach, and serve them. But in some respects, the station's service economy is less a break from occupation precedent than a continuation of it, particularly when it comes to the military sex trade. DS9 is, among other things, a base, and as international relations scholar Cynthia Enlow cautions, quote, to analyze any base as if it were simply the sum of its budget, its equipment, its land, its chain of command, its legal basis, and its mission is to seriously underestimate all the power that is used to manage it, all the ideas that are devised to underpin it, and all the policies that are implemented to keep it running smoothly. Smoothly, Enlow notes, usually serves to perpetuate patriarchal international relations. Cardassian rule brought cohorts of Bajoran women to the station, forcing them into military sexual servitude. While Bajoran independence ended that odious practice, Quark's gambling facilities, the Ferengi roulette-style games of Dabo and Tongo, as well as a dartboard, are still tended by tall, buxom hostesses. These workers come from all over, but many are Bajoran war orphans who are often breadwinners for themselves and their surviving kin. Known colloquially as Dabo girls, these workers are tasked with titillating customers, distracting them from just how much money they're losing, with, to use Enlow's terms, smoothing the flow of gold-pressed latinum, which is the sort of currency for the Ferengi, and quite a fetish object, into the proprietor Quark's eager hands. In everyday station life, the term Dabo girl circulates variously as a pejorative, a matter-of-fact description, and a reclaimed term of pride. Season 4's Bar Association is among DS9's finest episodes, and one of a number of especially socially consequential episodes directed by Black artists, in this case by Trek veteran LeVar Burton. In Bar Association, a Ferengi waiter named Rom nearly dies of an ear infection that his brother and employer, the callous restaurateur Quark, refused to permit him time off to have examined. When the station's doctor, Julian Bashir, admonishes Rom for not seeking care sooner, Rom explains that for the Ferengi, contracts grant bosses total control over workers' whereabouts. These workers also seem to permit bosses to harass employees, as Quark speculates wildly about Bajoran Dabo hostess Lita's intimate life in front of her fellow workers. Although Lita does not hesitate to tell Quark where to go, the fact that Quark would feel entitled to engage in such speculation at all provides a revealing glimpse of the ugliness of everyday gendered class relations at the bar. Appalled by Rom's contractual constraints, Bashir idly suggests that Rom and his coworkers should form a union. Although Rom doubts that other Ferengi waiters would be open to unionization, he soon embraces Bashir's suggestion. The last straw is Quark's cynical use of the Bajoran Cleansing Festival, the month when Bajorans abstain from drinking and gambling, as an excuse to implement altogether unnecessary austerity measures, cutting wages by a third. Here, we see explicitly that while the United Federation of Planets, the default protagonists of the Star Trek universe and stand-ins for the US or West, might have transcended wage labor by the 24th century, post-occupation Bajor most certainly has not. When Lita, whose people, we must remember, have only recently beaten back the decimating 50-year Cardassian occupation, exclaims in horror, "I can't afford a pay cut." At stake for her is not spending money or personal fulfillment, but survival. Lita's remark also throws DS9's many liaisons between wage-dependent Bajoran hostesses and secure, supposedly post-capitalist Starfleet officers into a different economic light. But Quark's exploitation of his so-called idiot brother, Rom, turns out to be a double-edged sword for the restaurateur. Rom knows the ledgers of his brother's business well enough to call bullshit. Quark doesn't need to make these wage cuts. Rom's proposed union, the Guild of the Guild of Restaurant and Casino Employees, is greeted by Bajoran Dabo girls, but meets hesitation from Ferengi staff. Ferengi workers don't want to stop the exploitation, Rom laments. We want to find a way to become the exploiters. The waiter's hesitation is not a matter of static backward Ferengi culture, but a product of the clear and present danger of a pro-market interventionist Ferengi state agency, the Ferengi Commerce Authority, as a repressive actor. Bar Association is the second of actor Jeffrey Combs's 8 appearances as Inspector Brunt, an overzealous FCA agent who loathes Quark's entire family. In interviews, Combs describes Brunt as, quote, a complete right-wing devout Ferengi, and, quote, the IRS guy from hell, the guy who just kept coming back to make your life miserable audit after audit after audit. Even saying the word union, Rom's fellow waiter Grimp worries, could lead to the seizure and closure of all of a Ferengi man's financial accounts by the FCA, a permanent emasculating exile from Ferengi economic personhood. But Rom is all in, summoning a confidence that we've never before seen in this character. If they're going to come after us, he tells his comrades, let's give them a good reason. We've been exploited long enough. It's time to be strong, take control of our lives, our dignity, and our profits. His confidence proves contagious. The Guild presents its demands to Quark, who rejects them out of hand. The Guild goes on strike, bribing customers not to patronize Quarks. So here we might see what's called labor organizing with Ferengi characteristics. Inside the bar, a shocked Quark scrambles to replace workers with holographic versions of himself, but the holograms are buggy and keep crashing. This hilarious scene offers an important corrective to the premise held by many economists who write about Star Trek that 24th century technology will simply eliminate so-called low-skilled work. Dream as capitalists might about replacing workers with cheap, efficient, obedient machines, threats to automate away work are often seriously exaggerated, an age-old rhetorical tactic to depress wages. In truth, the absence of a willing workforce presents Quark with a serious threat. As feminist geographers Yui Hashimoto and Caitlin Henry contend, quote, capitalism depends on social reproduction being free or very cheap, and raising its value shakes the foundations of such a system, one that is racist, anti-poor, patriarchal, and heteronormative. Quark and his eponymous holograms attract few customers during the strike, but they do elicit sympathy from one surprising source. Although he is no friend to Quark, the station's top cop, Constable Odo, comes from a community whose history of marginalization leaves him deeply averse to mob persecution. And he sees in this incipient working class democracy the tyranny of the majority. But Odo's alacrity to intervene on Quark's behalf is reined in by Captain Sisko, who forces Quark to negotiate in good faith with the Guild, threatening to change the terms of Quark's station lease agreement if he does not. Chapter 1 of A Different Trek, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A, details how Avery Brooks's Black working class roots and sensibility powerfully shaped DS9, both on set and on screen. In the 1990s, an era when centrist Democrats ratified so-called free trade and snubbed unions and Black voters as having, quote unquote, nowhere else to go, Captain Sisko showed the difference it can make and can still make to have agents of the state willing to intervene on behalf of labor instead of capital. Rahm and his comrades also get encouragement from Dr. Bashir and the station's chief of operations, Miles O'Brien, who are themselves descendants of survivors of English imperialism. O'Brien shares the example of his distant relative, Sean Aloysius O'Brien, who died leading a successful coal workers' strike in Pennsylvania in 1902 that won wage increases and a decrease in the length of the working day. Bashir and O'Brien even get into a brawl with the security officer Worf after he crosses the picket line. And as I was preparing for this talk, I spent some time watching Haskell Wexler's play about Harry Bridges, and it really got me thinking about the role that migrant workers have played in the sort of knowledge transmission that radicalizes labor movements in ways that I think resonate with the Sean O'Brien vignette that Miles O'Brien provides. And although Sean O'Brien, is fictitious, the successful 1902 Pennsylvania anthracite coal strike really did happen. And feminist Star Trek scholar Sarah Wenger points out that the Quark strike also recalls Playboy Bunny's efforts at unionization in the 1960s and 1970s. So, unable to replace workers with automation, unable to enlist law and order, or pit the administrative state on his side, unable to attract regular customers, and unable to pit Ferengi workers against non-Ferengi, Quark resorts to bribing, to bribing his brother, who is at this point excitedly poring over the Communist Manifesto and utterly unmoved. An excellent recent review of Bar Association in Labor Notes sums up Rahm's praxis with the ingenious portmanteau of Romunism, while the delightful leftist dirtbags of the gay communist podcast Soytrek joke that, quote, you haven't read Marx until you've read it in the original Ferengi. The strike at Quarks is only broken by the violent intervention of the Ferengi Commerce Authority, which sends Nausicaan Pinkertons to rough up Rahm's family. Ironically, this means attacking Quark, who also happens to be management, demonstrating the FCA's zealous commitment to disciplining labor, even when it means hurting capital in the process. Here, the FCA lampoons a core irony of neoliberal statecraft, which is often heavily interventionist, particularly in its commitment to law and order, despite laissez-faire pretensions. Moved by his brother's suffering, Rahm reluctantly agrees to formally disband the union, just long enough to get the FCA off the case. In return, Rahm meets the guild's demands: increased wages, shorter hours, and paid sick leave. In a way, the settlement reverberates with the story of the so-called alt-labor movement, which organizes sectors like agriculture and domestic work where unionization is impossible due to often racially motivated legal constraints. The strike is also transformative for Rahm and his comrades personally. As anyone who has participated in strikes knows, they can be exhausting, frustrating, and at times, frankly, boring. But strikes can also be exhilarating experiences of solidarity, raising workers' expectations for ourselves, our comrades, and the possibility of better worlds. Rahm's time spent with Lita on the picket line kindles a romance between them. His newfound confidence also leads him to leave his job at Quarks. Refusing to live solely for the possibility of inheriting his brother's bar, Rahm uses his technical skills to secure steady public sector work as a Bajoran station maintenance engineer. If the strike taught me anything, he tells Quark, is that I do a lot better when you're not around. Bar Association, then, is a delightful exception to cultural studies scholar Dan Hassler-Forrest's salient observation that Star Trek rarely fleshes out the democratizing implications of its post-capitalist premise. Ironically, refusing to follow Star Trek franchise rules and simply banish money, as previous shows had, enabled DS9 to critique capitalism in the 24th century and in the 20th. Actor Armin Shimmerman, who plays Quark and is one of a number of Trek actors with a history of leadership in the Screen Actors Guild, has praised the episode for addressing class contradictions that mainstream television often elides. People think of this as a comic episode, and it is, of course, he says, but in truth, it's really about union management problems. And the irony of it is that I play management in the episode. So I thought that to make Rum have a reasonably hard job as a union organizer, I would really have to be tough about it to show the struggle to the audience. Although you don't see it on TV very often, this is something that goes on in America all the time. Rather than some distant future in which technology smoothly outsources so-called repetitive, energy-intensive, low-skill, high-output labor to machines, Bar Association critically reflects the rise of a service economy in the United States, returning us to the contradictions of our own world and the struggles to transform it. And so this brings me to my third and final question. What are the uses of Star Trek? To be sure, looking to art alone, whether as responsible for our collective political failures or as an antidote to them, is wrong-headed. Even as DS9 is replete with what Black and religious studies scholar Ashanti Crawley calls otherwise possibilities, cultural geographer Emily Cameron sagely warns that there remains a real danger of, quote, reifying possibility itself, such that the political work required to achieve the hoped-for state is deferred. Even if DS9 offered some crystal clear roadmap for revolution, as actor Avery Brooks tells speculative fiction writer Kate Tempest Bradford, the question remains whether we, quote, find a way to integrate these things that we believe into our lives. If writer and activist Adrienne Marie Brown is correct in the claim that all community organizing is a kind of speculative fiction, then the question requires us to turn to science fiction creators of a different sort. A Different Trek offers an analysis of DS9's allegories that emphasizes the centrality of the Black freedom struggle to left internationalisms, the creativity of progressive Jewish artists, the urgency of Palestinian human rights and self-determination, and the necessity of collective provisioning for social reproduction. Given these priorities, all royalties from this book's sale will be split between 3 organizations doing urgently needed work addressing these concerns. And these are the Black Alliance for Peace, Jewish Voice for Peace, and the Los Angeles Unhoused Aid and Advocacy Group Koreatown for All. Each of these exemplary cooperative human efforts seeks far-reaching transformations that might yet make Earth a place where all of humanity, conceived in a truly ecumenical way, enjoys the material and political conditions needed to thrive. I also plan to continue teaching Star Trek for as long as it helps invite my students to consider uses for their science and engineering educations that serve the common good rather than capital and empire. Occasionally, a student, colleague, or alum will come to my office eager to chat about the technological innovations that Star Trek has anticipated or inspired. When this happens, I smile and listen intently. I am not an incurious person, and many technical aspects of Trek genuinely fascinate me as well. But I also cannot help but think of Reverend Martin Luther King's words in Beyond Vietnam, a speech that he gave about a month after meeting Nichelle Nichols and encouraging her to remain on Star Trek. King said that when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. I then gently advise my fellow Trekkers that what matters most is what people have used Star Trek to do politically on our own planet in the here and now, and the radical imaginations that it has affirmed and inspired. This includes Nichelle Nichols' work with NASA, her vision for a truly inclusive human scientific enterprise. It includes the politically conscientious interventions of DS9's on and off-screen counter-narrators like Avery Brooks, LeVar Burton, and Armin Shimmerman. It includes the outspoken invocation of Star Trek by radical journalists like Brianna Joy Gray and Kelly Hayes. And it includes calls for Palestinian self-determination from Trek actors like Michelle Forbes and Wallace Shawn. Finally, it includes the radical dreams of millions of ordinary trekkers, many of them savvy and critical consumers. To this list, though, we might finally and most recently add the striking Star Trek writers and actors who have leveraged the many anti-capitalist messages in Star Trek itself, as well as unlicensed images produced by fan artists, including Will Burroughs' amazing work, which also graces my book's cover, on the Screen Actors Guild and Writers Guild of America picket lines in Hollywood and in social media. So that there on the left is Chase Masterson, who played Lita in Bar Association, who is also depicted on that poster. So it gets very meta. More than anything, I hope that A Different Trek lends a little further coherence, validation, legitimacy, and encouragement to such radical uses, and that it creates the occasion for more of them. For all its considerable contradictions, in its best moments, as Avery Brooks explains with a laugh, Star Trek, and I would argue DS9 most of all, still enlivens us to quote, the wonder of being alive, the wonder of possibility. That's what Mr. Roddenberry created, etc. Not alone, but that's what he did. And then Brooks grins, the people took it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I see here there's a 40% off book coupon here with this final slide. Excellent. So please write that down. Thank you so much, David, for coming in and sharing this work. It's absolutely fantastic. Again, as a Trekker, obviously I'm a little biased, and I absolutely love this stuff. And I know we've got a couple hardcore Trek fans on the call here. So I would again encourage folks, if you have questions for David, feel free to just throw them in the chat. I've got a couple that were submitted ahead of time that are absolutely fantastic. But just before we even get started, I just wanted to say, I mean, I'm of the age where I can recall the debut of Deep Space Nine and being just profoundly disappointed in terms of just where my expectations were, in terms of the Trek I'd experienced up until that point. I was also, very much raised in Star Wars, and so I had a very clear sort of vision of what I was going to be given, and yeah, it was just kind of shocking. And I think that, and I'd love to hear you talk more about sort of the moment that Deep Space Nine emerged from, because when you mentioned that quote from Rodney King and this idea of being sort of stuck here, I mean, that is, I've subsequently come to love Deep Space Nine, but it took sort of a political education that was, partially due to my viewing of Deep Space Nine, but this idea of being sort of stuck together as just like a radical departure from, the tradition that Star Trek had established. And I think that your formulation, that Star Trek's movement up until that point was a way of avoiding consequences, and how I think one of the writers said, this show is going to be fundamentally different because it's going to be all about consequences, is really interesting, because it's, we're kind of, looking at the 90s versus looking at the 60s. By the 90s, we're really at sort of the end of empire, right? This like moment of kind of inward searching, right? What happens when there's nowhere else to go. So really fascinating. And I will say, I absolutely, that quote, all community organizing as a kind of speculative fiction, I will be recycling that till the day I retire, because that is, I think, there is something in that relationship between, solidarity, like what gets us together, moving in the right direction, and, the capacity to sort of imagine, right? Almost in a speculative way, what the future could hold. So absolutely fantastic stuff. If no one else has any questions, and again, feel free to add them to the chat. I did want to talk a little bit about one of the things that's always struck me as kind of unique about Star Trek just in general. And I sort of came up with TNG. I was always surprised by the degree to which, Trek accommodated actors who were very interested in directing, who were very interested in writing, and I think, as I've gotten to know more about the politics behind Trek, and as you just pointed out, these weren't uninterested actors. When you look at, like you said, Nichelle Nichols, Armin Shimmerman, these are folks who were actively involved in organizing. And I was just wondering, I know you said that you've got a chapter on sort of Avery Brooks and sort of his history off screen. I was wondering if you talk more about maybe some of the actors who weren't just actors, right, behind Star Trek, the people who kind of threw, their whole selves behind these roles.
Absolutely. I think Nichelle Nichols is a fantastic example. She's someone who had a very successful career on Broadway and singing with Duke Ellington before Star Trek, and one that she could have easily just left and gone back to. But because she was also an active participant in civil rights and anti-war movements, she had an occasion to meet Martin Luther King Jr., who encouraged her to stay, who saw her work on Star Trek as a contribution to the Black freedom struggle. A lot of liberal Star Trek fans like to tell that part of the story, but what they tend to leave out is that they met when he was giving a speech against the Vietnam War. So we have to connect this sort of good and important and necessary celebration of representation of Black people and Black women on television with the kind of anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist dimensions of the Black freedom struggle that liberals tend to want to leave off the table. Avery Brooks is amazing. He has been playing Paul Robeson, the great musician, athlete, Renaissance man, communist, on stage in this one-man show by Philip Dean Hayes since the late 1970s. The family of Robeson actually didn't terribly like Hayes's play, but they loved Avery Brooks's interpretation of the character in spite of the material. And Brooks is brilliant, right? He followed Robeson's footsteps in going to Rutgers. He was a professor of theater, earned an MFA at Rutgers and then taught at Rutgers. If you listen to interviews with him, he talks about having a very, very clear sense of history, both as an artist who was following in the footsteps of people like Robeson and people like Canada Lee, people like Brock Peters, other Black artists, some of whom were blacklisted during the Red Scare, but also his own family history, right? His family moves from the Mississippi Delta to Indiana, where he's raised, and his father is a union steward. I think his father was a tool and die maker, and that kind of working class Black sensibility shows up on stage. Nana Visitor, who played Kira, and Sirach Lofton, who played Jake Sisko, both talk about how Avery Brooks was the only person on the set of DS9 who knew everybody's name, every actor, every crew person, so there was something about him that just had this sense that everybody counts and everybody matters in a way that kind of inflected what the workplace was like. Another really interesting example, I think, is Colin Meaney, who plays Miles O'Brien, who I mentioned briefly, the one whose ancestor had been in the anthracite coal strike in Pennsylvania, supposedly. Colin Meaney comes out of the Irish left, and there's a strong history of overlap in Ireland between theater and the political left. He moved to England to work during the Troubles and had a lot of experiences of kind of ethnic profiling as an Irish person when Irish men were all assumed to be terrorists in England. And then sort of comes to the United States on and off to work. People know Colin Meaney from, I think, like Con Air and he often plays villains. But on DS9, he kind of plays this working class hero, although I have some things to say about that in chapter 5, because I think his wife, Keiko Ishikawa O'Brien, doesn't get enough credit for her work, both doing social reproduction work in the O'Brien household, but also in seeking to collectivize the work of social reproduction largely sort of out of sight. I mentioned Wallace Shawn, who plays Grand Nagus Zek. Wallace Shawn is great. He's, people know him from The Princess Bride. They know him from My Dinner with Andre, but he's a wonderful sort of socialist essayist who uses and playwright who uses his acting to subsidize his political and his other creative work. He's on the board of Jewish Voice for Peace and is like I think Haymarket actually published both of his essay collections, and they're just wonderful. And of course, Armin Shimmerman has been in the leadership of the Screen Actors Guild and speaks very eloquently about how the Ferengi, who are often read as a kind of anti-Semitic caricature, are actually meant as a critique of sort of the white Protestant bourgeoisie, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, that sort of thing. So a lot of the actors, I think, have really interesting political itineraries beyond what you see on screen, but it also does sort of show up in certain aspects of the interpretation of the characters.
It's really interesting, especially when you run down the list like that. I mean, there's just been so many, extremely influential folks involved with this show. I'm kind of curious. It definitely seems to me, and again, like I'm operating within my own bubble here, but it feels like Deep Space Nine is having kind of a moment right now, and I'm sort of curious. You talked a little bit in your presentation about sort of the politics. That sort of its immediate inheritances, like what fueled it throughout the 90s. I'm kind of curious to know if you have any theories yet on sort of kind of explaining why this sort of recent return back to Deep Space Nine. Because I mean, if I recall correctly, like I mean, again, like you said, it was sort of the often neglected sort of installment in this series, but it's sort of been embraced more recently as maybe one of the more, probably the most sophisticated in the series, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cynical, it's like generic answer is like nostalgia, and like the kind of the commercial work to which nostalgia is put. It's for that reason that I actually really admire that Avery Brooks is like not interested in doing any kind of reboot. I think there's something profoundly ethical about that. But I think that the less cynical answer, and the one that I'm more kind of attracted to, I guess, is that DS9 holds up politically. It's commenting critically on a lot of the crises of the 1990s that have only gotten deeper since then. It's responding to sort of the rise of neoliberalism and the rise of neoliberalism within the Democratic as well as the Republican Party. It's responding to Rodney King. It's responding and trying to learn from the First Intifada in Palestine. And it's commenting critically on sort of U.S. imperialism. So, so much of what we find ourselves stuck in now, to return to Rodney King, I think, has at least some roots in the 1990s. I also think that this is a partially stolen analogy, but I'm really attached to it, so I'll tell it to you. I think even though there are socialist utopian elements on The Next Generation, and I love The Next Generation, it is arguably a more liberal show in its vision of politics, and things tend to end up, all tied up with a bow at the end of most of the episodes in a way that you don't see on Deep Space Nine. So I'm sort of fond of saying that if watching Star Trek: The Next Generation is like taking Klonopin and going to a Unitarian church, you've got the like nice hum in the background and it's kind of soothing. Watching Deep Space Nine is like getting sober and reading Cornell West. Like Deep Space Nine, I think, is really a reckoning. And I think that survives many people's kind of political maturation as they maybe move from liberalism to leftism. And as the times have changed, and I think critique of capitalism maybe since 2008 or so, or 2016, has been much more intelligible and much more broadly shared, DS9 is going to hold up in a way that something like The West Wing, certainly, or even TNG, which again does have some utopian socialist elements, doesn't endure with quite the same kind of ferocity, I think.
So you're not recommending a review of The West Wing, to be clear.
No, absolutely not. TNG, sure, but West Wing that's where I draw the line.
I can only imagine at this point. We've got a question on the chat here. This author writes, it's kind of easy to point to Trek's influence or prediction of contemporary tech, cell phones, tablets, etc. Are there Trek influences in labor organizing, lefty policy, social issues, or is it more commentary than influential?
That is a great question. I think that it's probably commentary, but I think we have to understand the relationship between the commentary and or let's say the text and the audience is a dialectical one. Because there's all kinds of critical interpretive work that's happening on the part of fans that is then very directly informing what writers are doing, especially as the business model kind of evolves, right? Like I was just at a panel in Germany at the Science Fiction Research Association conference, and one of the panelists was talking about how like Star Trek fan Reddit has become this thing that gets mined by writers' rooms as they're sort of searching for like new possible premises. So there's a bit of interaction on that front. In terms of like innovating policy though, or like imagining other kinds of left organizing possibilities, I'm not sure about that. I think, I think part of the function of science fiction and part of the function of utopia is always about educating desire and like orienting us to other possibilities. But I think what Deep Space Nine in particular is good at, because it is a response to the kind of unabashed utopianism of the original series in the 1960s, is more diagnostic and more critical. So the original series is imagining this future without money, without interpersonal conflict, without racism, without war, without religion. And DS9 is sort of saying, you know, how far are we, how far have we fallen from that possible future? The 60s is a show, where eugenics is prohibited, right? Well, what happens in the 80s and 90s? Dolly the sheep, the Human Genome Project, Gattaca, but also importantly, and horrifyingly, the bell curve, right? Like we see this reassertion of eugenic explanations for inequality that had fallen out of favor after World War II. DS9 comes along and sort of seeks to repudiate that. By bringing up the topic of genetic engineering and then critiquing it really severely in ways that would have been just totally forbidden to even address on the original series. So I don't know if it's proleptic in that sense, but I want to keep thinking about that. It's a really good question. I know that like Gene Roddenberry, for instance, in the original series had wanted to include things like queer sexualities. Like that was his kind of original vision, and that didn't really get realized until far later in the history of the franchise. So I think what you see on screen is itself also a product of a lot of contestation behind the scenes, but I need to keep thinking about that one.
Well, and the thing too about Deep Space Nine and TNG is there's so much of it, right? Like you're right in the book. Um, one of my favorite lines from I think it's the opening chapter. You say, rather than racist or anti-racist, then Star Trek is both racist and anti-racist, colonial and anti-colonial, capitalist and anti-capitalist, patriarchal and feminist, heteronormative and queer all at once, right? And it's just, because there are, I mean, we're talking about seasons that have what, like 20 to 30 episodes per season. I mean, there's just so much content. And actually before everybody else hopped on the Zoom, I was asking about just kind of like, the fingerprints of individual writers as they, that they made on individual episodes. I can imagine, that you have sort of a real spectrum of political opinion in that writer's room, and just with the the pressures of having to generate so much content each year, it's like, all right, your turn, your episode, like, go for it. It just seems like that you get it's a recipe for that kind of you know contradictions or inconsistencies in terms of overall message, that I think makes it like a really dynamic and exciting sort of cultural text to study. I mean, it's big, right? But it is it contains multitudes, right? Um,
Yeah, and I think the bigness creates lots of room for lots of little interventions, because there's so many hands that go into it, that if any of those workers have any kind of critical consciousness at all, whether they're writers, whether they're actors, they find their way of sort of making an imprint on it. So even though all cultural work is sort of recycled, but then it reinvented, even though they're recycling a lot of, I mean, who wrote this? white boomers, what were they reading and watching growing up? Westerns, World War II movies, and like the golden age of science fiction, like Heinlein, Asimov, you know. So you see a lot of that get reinvented. But Avery Brooks is going to do it in his own little way, right? Nichelle Nichols, you know, would actively say to people, I'm not reading that. If she thought a line was racist, she would say, I'm not reading that. You're either going to have to cut it or give it to somebody else, because I'm not. So Andre Carrington has this wonderful idea of counter narrators. So I think like it, rather than something that is like the vision of one person, even Ira Bear, who I think is really sort of one of the geniuses behind this, when we attend to how many different layers of labor are at work, all kinds of possibilities for intervention, interception, and rerouting start to open up.
Can you tell us a little more about the class you teach on Star Trek and geography?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I teach at a sort of STEM liberal arts hybrid institution called Harvey Mudd College, which is about 35 miles east of LA. And all the students are required to take 11 liberal arts courses in addition to a major in some kind of science or engineering field before they graduate. So in my course, I have the students spend the first half of the semester reading kind of critical theories around race, class, gender, sexuality, and empire, and then watching relevant episodes of Star Trek that speak critically to those themes. And then the second half of the class, they have to write their own research papers on some aspect of the cultural politics of Star Trek. It can be something that speaks more specifically to their interests, but it does have to address sort of questions of difference and power and inequality in some sort of substantive way. So I've taught that class using Deep Space Nine in the past. I'm now teaching it using Voyager because I'm starting to write a little bit about Voyager, so it becomes like a laboratory for me. But I learned so much from the students because they bring their own concerns and then read those through allegories and open up new interpretations of them. So students are thinking a lot about questions of economic inequality. I have more students interested in sort of anti-capitalist readings of Star Trek than ever before. But I also have students who are trying to think about like asexual or aromantic identities, who are trying to think about disability, who are trying to think about trans identities. I have students who are doing minors in music who are really interested in sort of the cultural politics of what musics get included or excluded from the Star Trek canon. So I end up learning a ton from them. And actually in the book, I think there's a footnote where there was a particular interpretation of a particular scene where like it was like a particular section of the class that like noticed that detail, and so I give them credit for doing that because it was like a really brilliant close reading.
That's outstanding, and I guess that actually may tie into this question here that was posed in the chat. Which episodes do you think have withstood the test of time? Do you have like a top five in terms of your favorites, or this is which episodes seem to speak or contribute the most about fundamental issues or truths?
Yeah, I mean, I raise most of the episodes that I single out and do close readings of in the book, I think do. I think the first chapter highlights three that are especially worth mentioning, which are Far Beyond the Stars, Past Tense Parts 1 and 2, and In the Pale Moonlight, all of which are very Captain Sisko centric. But Past Tense and Far Beyond the Stars are really offering very salient critiques of US racial capitalism. One revisits Earth in the 1950s and the other revisits Earth in the year 2024 and imagines sort of urban uprisings in the face of really carceral treatment of unhoused people in San Francisco. 2024 is not that far away. And then In the Pale Moonlight is about essentially Sisko acting as a kind of war criminal. And what does it mean to have this sort of person who is in some ways very progressive, who is African-American, doing things that he knows is wrong in the service of sort of a liberal form of imperialism? And how do we grapple with those contradictions? Are we supposed to read Sisko as a kind of Obama figure? Are we supposed to read him as a sort of ordinary rank and file Black soldier or military worker who is sort of doesn't want to be in this situation but is doing what he has to do? I think it leaves us in a place of great unease, but I think that unease is tremendously productive for thinking about a lot of the contradictions of sort of liberal imperial multiculturalism or military multiculturalism. Bar association is another great example. There are a couple of episodes that I do read in the book that I don't think hold up, that I don't think are very good, but that I think if we kind of read them sideways or we read them for their world building, they offer us like an interesting set of premises that are worth exploring anyway. So not everyone that I take up in the book is necessarily a winner. Like a few are definitely stinkers, but uh, there's these political scientists in the 90s, Hassler and Wilcox, who talk a lot about how often the most interesting like political world building work in science fiction happens in the B plot, happens in like throwaway background stuff. And so sometimes it's still worth it to attend to that, even if it's not the best kind of aesthetically or even politically.
Oh, we get agreement from the chat. Far Beyond the Stars is awesome. I will say the past tense one and two. Oh my God, that I just recently rewatched those, and I guess I'd remembered sort of the overall arc of the plot. I did not remember that it takes place in 2024, and it just felt a little too on the nose. But yeah, if you're only gonna check out a few episodes, those are some great recommendations. I guess we've got time for maybe one or two more. And I see, oh, actually, we've got one that just came in on the chat here. Somebody who's never watched Star Trek or DS9, but loves the politics of perhaps a Star Wars question, especially in the TV show Andor, which touches on colonialism and resistance. Would you recommend any specific episodes, arcs to watch, like the one mentioned earlier about the Ferengi and unionization, other than the ones you just mentioned? I'm curious to know about your take on Star Wars and whether or not you checked out Andor, which actually had a work stoppage episode, which was pretty amazing.
I love Andor, first of all. And I think if you want good science fiction recommendations, I would highly recommend Cheryl Vint and Jonathan Alexander have this book, Programming the Future, which is sort of like a queer and leftist study of 21st century science fiction television. And so they kind of go over the good, the bad, and the ugly, but they point us to some other really rich allegories. The Onion did a guide to like how to watch each Star Trek series in maybe 2014. And, they say like with some of them, you can skip the first few seasons because they're bad, but with DS9, they say you kind of have to watch it all. and I think that like, there's so much world building that's like, seems like background or seems innocuous, even in relatively, even in episodes that are ostensibly addressing other things, that I think it can be hard to pick and choose. That said, throughout the book, I lift up, close readings of like certain episodes I think are especially relevant. The Ferengi arc, I think there's like a solid, number of episodes that are like very Ferengi centric, that are kind of worth watching on their own because they give us a story about, sort of gradual moves towards something like economic democracy in the most capitalist society in the Star Trek universe. But I think with DS9, you kind of, there's advantages to kind of approaching it whole hog. So, if you want recommendations, I would say check out the book, just like, through the UWT library, look at it for free. But I think The Onion is right about there being some value in really investing in the sort of staying with the world building of it.
Excellent. And that's Programming the Future. I have not heard of that. I'm going to check that out. Excellent. We got one question on the chat board. Does your book explore? Oh, this one I was actually going to touch on too. Book explore how DS9 challenged the idea of cultural essentialism or reductionism. That in it, many of the races that were more flatly portrayed in earlier series, the Klingons or warriors. I feel like some of these different aliens are sort of also raced, right? Ferengi are greedy, get rounded out. I was rewatching a segment where Dax notes that even some Klingons are cowards. Then there are many changes that happen to Ferengi society throughout the whole series.
100%. Yeah. In chapter 4 of the book, which is called Defetishizing the Ferengi, I'm really interested in how the Ferengi are kind of rolled out in the next generation as this kind of caricature. And then, they're meant to be a major antagonist, but it doesn't really work. And then they get reduced to comic relief. But DS9 actually gives us a much more fulsome and three-dimensional view of the Ferengi that kind of challenges a lot of the tropes associated with them. I think the Klingons are an interesting case because we get more nuanced portraits of individual Klingons that like depart from stereotypes, but we never really get with the Cardassians, we get a dissident movement. With the Ferengi, there's kind of a feminist move towards sort of economic democracy that happens. With the Klingons, we never really get anything approaching the left, as a kind of political formation. We just get like good intellectuals or good individuals like Gowron and like corrupt individual or not Gowron, Martok and corrupt individuals like Gowron. So I think I try to explore throughout the book like which of these allegorical treatments are actually affording people with nuance or affording sort of extraterrestrial societies with nuance, and which of them are just sort of lapsing into essentialism. But I see quite a bit of room for hope in the Ferengi and the Cardassians for that matter. I actually think Kira's arc, where she goes from kind of Bajoran freedom fighter to actually forming alliances with Cardassians who were part of the dissident movement and who are themselves anti-colonial, offers a really interesting case study in kind of coalitional anti-imperialist politics.
God, I'm sorry. The questions keep flooding in on the chat board, and they're all really good. We got another one here, just in case there's time for one more, right?
Yeah.
Quark had a root beer speech about the Federation, bubbly and coy, I think, near the end of the series, maybe. Roddenberry's vision for the Federation was pretty utopian, right? As a fan, I love the big picture critique, but do you think Gene would have been disappointed they became more and more the villain, especially in more modern interpretations? And Roddenberry's position on Deep Space Nine was pretty complicated, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not clear because he passed in 1991, and the show started filming the following year. But Susan Sackett, who was like a longtime kind of collaborator of his, really insisted that he would have hated it. I'm not sure about that. And I think there is a sense in which DS9 has a particular fidelity to the original series. And what I mean by that is it measures the distance between 1990s America and Roddenberry's sort of hoped for utopia that requires him to do that requires like more critical diagnostic work. I also think that there's a sense in which if we take the kind of more ensemble view of the labor that goes into making these cultural products that we were discussing earlier, we begin to dethrone the sort of cult of like the individual, kind of great white male genius and start to think about, what science fiction at its core is about is extrapolation. And so that's something, you can extrapolate from Roddenberry's premises whether he would have liked it or not, I think, in ways that are perhaps just as committed to the ideals of utopia, of sort of a society without war, without capitalism, without racism that he was. So I mean, it's a bit like a math problem, right? Like math professors aren't interested in seeing your answer, they're seeing sort of how you show your work, like how you got there. I think DS9 is true to Roddenberry's ideals, it's just pursuing them by a different set of means that requires holding up a critical mirror in a way, whereas he wanted to sort of hold up a utopian alternative. I think we're now so flooded with dystopia that maybe other kinds of interventions are necessary, although I do personally find myself very attracted to the critical mirroring that programs like Andor and The Expanse are sort of doing in the contemporary period.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's at this point too, I mean, we're several generations into Star Trek, right? Where it's it belongs as much to us as it belongs to anyone else, right? It's there's so much of it out there that it's it can be sort of appropriated and refashioned by so many different users in so many different ways. Excellent. I mean, I had one final question. I was just kind of curious. You mentioned the next project and like take a break, enjoy enjoy the celebrate the publication of this book, but obviously excited to see the next one. Just curious, where you see this book sort of participating in the ongoing conversation surrounding Star Trek, or just science fiction in general, and its sort of capacity to affect audiences in a really emotional way, and maybe kind of do some of that necessary work that is that is the work of maybe inspiring hope, and maybe imagining possibilities beyond sort of our current you know everybody's stuck together kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote the book during COVID. And I wrote it, I was on sabbatical in the fall of 2020, and there was like nothing to do because everyone was cooped up at home. So I wrote the book in a very kind of lonely but yearning place. And it's been wonderful to sort of get to know people who are interested in it, and to sort of see the ways in which it validates their own interpretations of or resonates with their own interpretations of the show. I definitely feel a lot less lonely not now than I did then. And so there's something hopeful about that whole process, I guess. One never really knows where these things will go. I think the beauty of a book is that they circulate in the world in a way that, like an academic article, even if you put it up for free on academia.edu and hope that the copyright people don't yell at you, it just doesn't have the same kind of tangibility or kind of circulation that a book does. But I've really delighted in getting to know people who are bringing so much intellectually, politically, aesthetically to the book. I was just saying before we sort of let everybody into the room that I was in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago, and like one of the first people in line was like this anti-Zionist rabbi who immediately bought 2 copies of the book for her friends, and just was like doing really interesting work around sort of Jewish Voice for Peace. So I think if this creates more occasion for like-minded people to meet and sort of share horizons for the future, and also share a little bit about the kind of political work they're doing, like I'm just grateful to be able to be a part of that.
Well, excellent. Hopefully, tonight's event was part of that larger process. I'm so glad that you're getting out and touring this book. I just want to get it in as many people's hands as possible. So if you're on the call, be sure to write down that code and pick yourself up a copy of this book. If you've never seen an episode of Deep Space Nine, you've got homework. But David, it was just an absolute honor to host you. This has been, like I mentioned before, everybody else hopped on. This was like the first event I made sure to book for this series, because I was so excited about this book, and it delivered. I mean, I can't wait to. I'm like halfway through it, so I can't wait to finish it. But thank you so much for your work, and I'm excited to see the next projects. And yeah, it was just great getting to talk to you tonight.
Thank you. The honor is mine. And I guess speaking of honor, I'll just close by saying kapla.
Nice. Live long and prosper.